The wind came down from the mountains like it had a purpose, slicing through the cottonwoods and scouring the hard-packed yard of the McBride homestead. It rattled the weathered boards of the old house, whispered through broken fence slats, and stirred dry grass until it hissed like a snake warning of trouble. At that hour, too early for chores but too late for dreams, the sky still held the bruises of night, deep purples fading into ash. Frost clung to the porch rail in brittle veins, and the earth crunched under worn boots. Josie McBride, 10 years, old and thin as a rail, stepped outside into that cold with her father's coat wrapped around her like a memory. The sleeves swallowed her hands, the shoulders sagged on her small frame, but the scent-faint saddle oil, pipe tobacco, old leather still clung to the fabric, still reminded her of a time when someone cared enough to tuck her in, not just bark orders. The smell was fading though, like everything else her father left behind, her boots, 2 sizes too big and stuffed with old rags, scuffed along the frozen dirt as she crossed the porch. She moved without complaint. Complaining got you nowhere in Sage Hollow. Not when you lived with Martha Langley, who had no use for softness and less for sentiment. Josie tightened her braid with one hand, her fingers clumsy and half-numb, her eyes grey like the storm-heavy sky were wide open. Already measuring the day ahead, the dog was waiting. Calder sat beside the woodpile, tail tucked against the wind, his blue merle coat speckled with frost. His ears twitched when he saw her. Not in excitement, not in the way town dogs did, but like he was listening for something she couldn't hear. Always watching, always still. He didn't rush her, didn't bark. He never barked unless it mattered. Josie crouched beside him and pressed her forehead into the thick fur at his neck. Calder didn't move, just let out a long, slow huff. His breath steamed between them, rising and vanishing into the frozen morning. Inside the house, a cupboard slammed hard and sharp. Josie tensed. "You think I got all day?" "Firewood don't stack itself," came the voice grating, dry, like fence wire pulled too tight. Martha Langley. Josie stood. Calder stood with her. The dog always stood with her. Martha wasn't kin, not really. She'd married Josie's uncle during the war, kept the land when the men didn't come home. No one in Red Butte Crossing said much about it. People out here had learned to mind their own business. What happened behind someone's door was their own affair. And the McBride homestead sat far enough from town that nobody came knocking anyway. Wind tugged at Josie's braid as she grabbed the first armload of firewood, the splinters biting her chapped fingers. Her shoulder ached from yesterday's punishment, not a beating, not really. Just the back of a spoon cracked across her arm hard enough to raise a welt. She'd spilled cornmeal, that was all. But Martha didn't need a reason. Martha called it correction. Calder trailed behind her like a ghost, silent and unnoticed. He never followed her inside. Not anymore. Martha didn't like dogs. She said Calder was too quiet, too clever, that he had the eyes of something wild. Josie hated leaving him out there, but lately, Martha had been watching the dog with a different look, cold, measuring. "Don't follow me in today, boy," Josie whispered. Calder stared inside. The warmth from the stove slapped her cheeks, but there was no welcome in it. The kitchen smelled of boiled grain and ash. A pot of thin something porridge or gruel, it was hard to tell, bubbled on the iron range. Martha stood beside it, her apron stained, sleeves pushed up, hair tied so tight it made her temples shine. She didn't look up as Josie stacked the firewood. "About time," she muttered. "You sleeping in now, princess?" "No, ma'am." Martha turned, eyes sweeping over Josie like she was assessing a piece of livestock, not liking what she saw. "Fix your hair, you look like a Comanche." Josie's hand went to her braid, fingers fumbling. Her scalp still sore from the last time Martha had yanked it for being messy. Outside, Calder circled the house once, and sat by the back stoop, watching. He always watched. Watched when Josie limped. Watched when she flinched. Watched when the silence stretched too long and too thin. The chores filled the morning, pumping water with stiff fingers, chopping kindling that splintered the wrong way, mending a sack with a needle that bit her thumb more than the cloth. Martha's voice followed her like a shadow sharp, always just behind, always on the edge of striking. Josie had stopped crying over a year ago. Martha said tears were a waste of water, and water was for drinking. Later, while gathering eggs, Josie knelt in the straw and leaned against the wall for a breath. Her arms were raw, her bones felt brittle. The cold was creeping through her coat like it had fingers. Just 1 minute, she told herself. 1 minute to rest. Something nudged her ribs. Calder. He stood beside her, breath fogging in the air. A feather was stuck in his fur. His eyes met hers, calm and steady. She wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder. She don't like you much, she whispered. Said you're too proud. Said a dog that don't fetch, don't earn his keep. Calder blinked slowly, resting his chin on her knee. She's wrong, Josie added. You're better than any person I know. His tail thumped once in the straw. Then the door creaked. Martha's shadow stretched across the chicken yard. You planning to nap the whole day? No, ma'am, Josie said. Standing fast, the wind picked up. Snow started to fall thin, drifting flakes that caught in Calder's fur and Josie's braid. That night, Josie stood at the window, wrapped in her thin quilt. The house creaked, the shutters shook. She looked toward the doghouse, where Calder curled tight against the cold. She ain't gonna feed you, Josie whispered to the glass. But I'll bring you scraps. The frost traced patterns across the pane. Below, Calder shifted. His eyes glowed faintly. Like embers in the dark, he watched the house. He always watched the house. And something inside him stirred, something deeper than training. Older than instinct. Something was coming. The snow didn't stop. By morning, it had gathered thick across the yard, burying footprints and fence lines beneath a pale, perfect silence. It softened everything, edges, sounds, even the hardness in the air. But Josie knew better than to believe it meant safety. In Sage Hollow, snow could hide things just as easily as it could protect them. She woke early, before the frost had melted from the inside of her attic window. Her breath curled in front of her like fog as she sat up, still bundled in her father's coat. The fire downstairs had died sometime in the night. She could feel the chill seeping through the boards beneath her feet, numbing her before she even found her boots. Downstairs, the house was quiet to quiet. The kind that came before Martha's voice cut through it like a blade. Josie moved, carefully, wrapping her scarf tight, her mittens stiff from yesterday's damp. She cracked the back door just wide enough to peer out. Snow covered the stoop and spilled across the yard like ash from a long fire. And there he was. Calder. The dog stood still in the drift, snow clinging to his coat. His breath hung in the air, thick and steady. He didn't move when she stepped outside, didn't blink. He watched the door the way a sentry watches the line between safe and not. Josie reached into her sleeve and pulled out a crust of bread and a strip of salted pork she'd stolen from last night's table. She held them out. Calder took the offering gently, his eyes never leaving hers. You can smell it, can't you? She whispered. More snow's coming. Calder gave a low huff, almost a sigh, and glanced over her shoulder at the house. Josie touched the ruff of his neck, fingers buried deep in fur. If I could run off with you, I would. But the moment didn't last. Behind her, a floorboard groaned. You feeding that seedless mutt again? Martha's voice cracked like a whip. Across the cold, Josie spun around, hands dropping to her sides. Martha stood in the doorway. Wool robe wrapped tight, boots already on. Her hair pulled back so hard it looked like it hurt. Her mouth pinched like she'd been sucking lemons. He's hungry, Josie said quietly. We're all hungry, Martha snapped, stepping past her. Her boots crushed through the snow with purpose. She looked down at Calder with a long, flat stare. I don't like the way he watches, thinks too much for a dog. He's not proud, Josie whispered. Martha's lip curled. Pride's the worst kind. Makes men forget they're mortal. Dogs too. She turned back toward the house. Get the eggs, and don't break any. This time, Josie obeyed. She always did. It wasn't fear, exactly, it was the knowledge of What happened when she didn't? By mid-morning, the cold had wrapped itself around her bones. Her breath felt sharp in her lungs. Every movement burned, but she kept working. She carried water, chopped what little dry wood they had left, sorted the feed buckets with fingers that didn't quite close anymore. Calder stayed close, but silent. A shadow with sharp eyes. He never interfered. But he watched. He saw when the rooster pecked her bare wrist hard, enough to bleed. He saw when the kindling cracked wrong and splinters drove under her nail. And he saw what happened next. In the kitchen, it was the flour that did it. Josie had climbed onto the stool to reach the high shelf, tipping the heavy sack of flour over the mixing bowl. A breeze slipped through the cracked window above the sink, tugging at her sleeve. Her hand jerked, just slightly, enough to spill a soft puff of white across the counter. Not much, a tablespoon, maybe two, but it was enough. Martha turned, her eyes narrowed, her hand shot out. "You damn fool girl," she hissed. Josie barely had time to flinch before the wooden spoon cracked across her shoulder. The sound was sharp, clear, final. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in over a year. She just turned her face to the side, jaw tight, eyes distant, and waited for the moment to pass, but it didn't pass. "Not this time," Calder growled. It wasn't loud. It wasn't long, but it was deep low, and primal, and filled with something that didn't belong in kitchens or farmyards. Something ancient. Martha froze. She turned slowly toward the window. Outside, Calder stood in the snow, framed by the white landscape like something from another world. His ears were back. His eyes glowed beneath the shadow of the eave, and his teeth were bared. "Get that mutt away from my house," Martha snapped. "He's not hurting anyone," Josie said, her voice low. "Not yet," Martha answered. "But he's thinking about it. You can see it in his eyes." Josie didn't answer. She just cradled her bruised arm. "I swear," Martha muttered. "Maybe it's time we put him to use or put him down." Josie's stomach dropped. That night, the house was silent again. The kind of silence that wasn't sleep. The kind that waited for the next wrong thing to happen. At supper, Martha didn't speak. She didn't scold. She didn't even glance at the spilled spoon when Josie dropped it trying to serve the thin soup. She just ate, wiped her mouth, and rose from the table. Then she did something Josie hadn't seen in years. She walked to the hearth and opened the old oak trunk. Inside, wrapped in velvet and memory, was her husband's pistol. A Colt .44 Dragoon. Heavy, mean. She unwrapped it, slowly, like she was waking something dangerous. Josie didn't breathe. Martha checked the chamber with practiced fingers, and set the gun on the mantel. "What are you doing?" Josie asked. Martha didn't answer. She just looked out the window, toward the place where Calder sat, unmoving, in the dark. Later that night, Josie slipped from her bed and crept down the stairs. She opened the back door quietly. Calder lifted his head. She knelt beside him, wrapped both arms around his neck. "She's thinking about it," she whispered. "I saw her. She hates you, more than anything. She's got the pistol out." She felt his breath against her chest, warm and steady. "I don't want you to go," she said, "but I can't stop her." Calder didn't run, didn't flinch, didn't blink. He stood up slowly. Not afraid, not defeated, but ready. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold still pressed hard against the land. And Josie, curled beside her dog in the dark, realized that something had shifted. Something inside Calder, something inside her. Morning would come, and it would not come quietly. The morning broke gray and grim, snow piling in thick layers across the field until the pasture looked like a blank page waiting for something to be written. The wind had shifted overnight, turning from sharp and cold to low and mean. It curled around the eaves of the house, whispering down the chimney like it knew something Josie didn't yet. She woke to the sound of Martha's boots pacing the floor downstairs. Not the usual shuffle and stomp of chores, but sharp, clipped steps. The kind of rhythm that made your stomach tighten before you even got out of bed. "Get your coat," Martha said when Josie appeared at the bottom of the stairs, still blinking the sleep from her eyes. Josie looked at her, puzzled. What for? You and that mutt have work to do. Martha didn't look at her when she said it. She was already lacing her boots, her coat pulled tight, the edges of her mouth drawn down in something that wasn't quite a frown but far from neutral. There was no food on the stove, no firewood stacked in the hearth, just cold air and colder silence. Outside, Calder stood in the yard, waiting. But something was different in the way he held himself, his tail hung low, ears drawn back, eyes sharp and motionless. He wasn't just watching anymore, he was bracing. Josie opened the door and stepped out, her boots sinking into the snow with a soft crunch. Calder didn't move toward her this time. He stood there, fixed, like he already knew where they were. Headed, Martha strode past them without another word, heading toward the far end of the property. Josie followed, her breath puffing in short clouds, fingers curled tight in her sleeves. Calder came behind her, each step deliberate, quiet as shadow. They moved in silence, past the barn, past the old well, toward the sheep pen that had half collapsed years ago and never been mended. The wood sagged under the weight of snow, and the gates hung on their hinges like broken wings. No animals had been kept here in months, maybe years. Martha stopped near the sagging shed and scanned the horizon, as if expecting someone to come riding over the hills. But no one came. Not here. Not in Sage Hollow. Not unless they had a reason. Go inside, Martha said finally. There's traps need clearing. My spin at the feed. Go on. Josie hesitated. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. What? About Calder, he's staying, Martha said flatly. I need to speak to him alone. Josie stared at her, the breath catching in her throat. He don't understand talk. Oh, he understands plenty, Martha muttered. And then she reached into her coat and pulled out the pistol. The wind stilled. For a second, the world held its breath. Josie stepped in front of the dog. Please, Aunt Martha. He ain't done nothing wrong. Martha didn't meet her eyes. Her focus was locked on Calder, as if the dog had spoken an insult only she could hear. He's proud, she said quietly, almost to herself. Just like your daddy, thought he could outrun death, too. Josie shook her head. You're not going to shoot him. Martha raised the pistol. Move aside, girl. Calder didn't wait. He moved in a blur of fur and snow, teeth sinking into the thick sleeve of Martha's coat, not to wound, not to kill, but to stop. To interrupt. The pistol fired, the shot cracking through the air like a tree splitting in a storm. It echoed across the frozen yard, rising into the mountains. Josie screamed. Martha stumbled back, the gun swinging wide. Calder released her and dropped low to the ground, ears pinned, ready for whatever came next. But nothing came. Because then through the trees HOOFBEATS. A rider burst through the tree line, rifle slung across his back, long coat flapping in the wind. His horse was flecked with sweat, breath steaming like smoke. Deputy Elias Ward. He dismounted before the horse had even fully stopped, boots crunching hard into the snow. What in blazes is going on? He called. Josie ran to him, tears freezing on her cheeks. She was going to shoot Calder, just for looking at her. Martha straightened, brushing snow from her coat, fury written across her face. That mutt snapped. Nearly bit me. I had to defend myself. Elias looked from the smoking pistol to Josie's pale face, then to the dog 10 paces away, chest heaving. Blood just beginning to show on the fabric of Martha's coat where Calder had torn the sleeve. But Calder wasn't moving. He stood still, watching Martha with eyes that saw everything. You bringing firearms into livestock disputes now, Miss Langley? Elias asked, voice calm but edged. That dog is a menace, she snapped. Fit for a working ranch, Elias knelt beside Josie, gently tugging down the scarf at her neck. A bruise bloomed beneath her joff. Faint yellowing, but real. That true? He asked her. Josie nodded. He was protecting me. She's a liar, Martha barked, just like her daddy. Full of stories and no good sense. Ilya stood. Slowly, something heavy settling behind his eyes. "You know," he said, "I've seen a lot out here. Men lying through their teeth, women covering up worse than words can say. But I've never seen a dog stand his ground like this one." Martha's lips curled. "You going to arrest a child and a dog based on feelings, deputy?" "No," Elias said. "But I'm not letting you shoot anything today." They returned to the house under a sky that had turned steel grey. Inside, Elias ordered everyone to sit. Martha hovered near the fire, arms crossed. Josie sat at the table, Calder underneath, his head resting on her boot. "You got anyone else?" Elias asked quietly. "Kin? Anyone not living here?" Josie shook her head. Martha muttered, her daddy had some cousin in Denver. Never answered letters, probably drunk in a ditch. Elias pulled a small notebook from inside his coat. The leather was worn smooth at the corners. "I'm not a judge," he said, "but I'll write up what I saw, what I heard. What's on this girl's arms? Let the marshal read it. Maybe get someone from Cheyenne to look into it." Martha rose, seething. "That dog attacked me." "He stopped you from shooting a child's only friend," Elias said. "You want to argue with God about that? Be my guest." Outside, the wind howled again. Inside, Calder didn't flinch, and for the first time in months, Josie felt something shift, not just in the room, but inside her, something steadier than fear. Something warm. Maybe it was justice, maybe it was hope. But whatever it was starting. The night dropped hard and bitter on Sage Hollow, like a lid sealing in all the day's heat and light. Cold crept into the corners of the house. The kind of cold that didn't just chill, it settled into your bones, made you ache without knowing why. The fire in the hearth burned low, barely enough to keep the frost from forming on the window glass. Martha Langley sat in her rocking chair, not moving, not speaking. She stared into the dying flames like she could will them to life without lifting a hand. Josie sat on the edge of a stool near the hearth. Her father's coat wrapped around her small frame, a tin cup of broth in her hands. It was thin and barely warm, tasting more of melted snow than anything else. She sipped slowly, not because it tasted good, but because it gave her something to do with her hands. Calder lay near the front door, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but ears twitching with every creak of wood. He hadn't eaten. Since the pistol was drawn, he hadn't moved much either, only to shift and watch. Josie hadn't left his side for long, not since Elias had gone back into the storm, leaving behind only silence and a warning. Martha hadn't said a word in hours, but Josie knew that kind of silence. It wasn't peace. It was something brewing. Later, when the house had gone still, Josie pulled her quilt tighter around her shoulders and lay on her bed, eyes wide open. Calder stayed by the door, unmoving. The wind scraped against the shutters like claws, but inside, nothing stirred. Until it did. It started with a whisper of movement on the stairs. Light, deliberate. Josie sat up. Calder was already on his feet, head lifted, tail stiff. A shadow moved across the hallway. Moonlight broke through a gap in the clouds and lit the frost on the windows like silver lace. Josie stepped to the edge of her room and looked down. She saw Martha, already dressed, coat on, boots laced, hair tied back. She moved like someone with a purpose, not chores, not a midnight walk. Something else. Josie crept down the stairs, pulling her boots on at the back door, careful not to let them thud against the floor. She opened the door just wide enough for her and slipped out into the yard. Calder followed, silent as ever. The barn loomed ahead, lantern light flickering faintly through the slats in the wall. Josie pressed herself to the side of the building, heart hammering against her ribs. She peeked through a crack in the boards. Inside, Martha stood beside the feed bins. In her hand, a knife. In her coat pocket, Josie could see the outline of something small and round, a glass vial. She watched as Martha poured powder from the vial into a tin bowl, mixing it with grain. Her movements were quick, sharp, like she'd practiced them in her mind a dozen times. Josie's stomach turned. She didn't hesitate. She burst through the barn door. "Stop it," she cried. Martha spun, startled, the knife gleaming in the lantern light. "You little brat," she hissed. "You had to follow, didn't you?" In the same breath, Calder tore through the doorway behind Josie, skidding to a stop between the girl and the woman. His teeth were bared, his stance wide, his growl low and guttural. Martha didn't flinch. She raised the knife. "You think you can scare me? I've buried worse than you," she spat. Then she lunged. Calder launched forward not to kill, but to deflect. His body hit Martha's knees, knocking her sideways. The blade swung wide, slashing his side. Josie screamed as blood darkened his fur. Calder yelped, but he didn't fall. He backed up quickly, positioning himself in front of Josie once more. Martha scrambled to her feet, slipping in the spilled feed. The tin bowl hit the floor with a clatter, grain scattering like coins across the wood. And then the barn door slammed open again. Deputy Elias Ward stood in the threshold, rifle raised, breath pouring from his mouth like steam. "Drop it," he barked. Martha froze. The knife trembled in her hand. "I said, drop it." She hesitated for half a breath too long, then let the blade fall with a sharp clatter. Josie dropped to her knees beside Calder, pressing her coat against the wound. "It's not deep," she whispered. "It's not deep. It's okay." Martha stumbled backward, her face twisted in fury. "He tried to kill me." "No," Josie said, louder this time. "She poisoned his feed. I saw her. She was going to kill him. He saved me again." Elias stepped forward, quiet, dangerous. "You just sealed your own fate, Martha Langley." She tried to step back, but he was already beside her, pulling a bandana from his coat and tying her hands. She cursed under her breath, stumbling on the straw, but Elias didn't loosen his grip. He led her out into the snow, dragging her like a sack of bad history in the barn. Josie stayed with Calder, stroking his fur, whispering nonsense into his ears. Words she didn't even realize she knew. "You're gonna be okay. You're the toughest thing I know." Elias returned a moment later, pulling a flask from his pocket. "Hold him still," he said gently. He poured the whiskey over the cut. Calder stiffened, but didn't bite, didn't even growl. Just breathed hard and blinked slowly. "Most men I know would have fainted by now," Elias muttered. "Tough dog," Josie nodded, her jaw set. "He always has been." Together, they lifted him onto a blanket and made a bed in the hay. Outside, the wind had calmed. The world held still again, but this time it didn't feel like fear. It felt like something had been broken open and cleaned out. Like something new could finally start. Back at the house, Elias shoved a chair under the knob of Martha's bedroom door. She'd be taken to Red Butte at first light, and then on to Cheyenne, where someone with a robe and a gavel would decide what came next. Poisoning an animal was bad. Doing it in front of a child worse. The law might be slow in these parts. But it wasn't blind. Josie didn't go back upstairs that night. She curled up beside Calder in the hayloft. Quilts pulled tight over both of them. The barn smelled of warm fur, smoke, and faint blood. But it felt safer than any place she'd known in months. Calder licked her cheek once and rested his head against her ribs. Josie stared at the beams above her, eyes heavy. "I won't let them take you," she whispered. "Not ever." Outside, an owl called from the trees. Inside, Calder closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, Josie followed him into sleep, knowing he'd still be there when she woke. Spring came to Sage Hollow like a secret passed between trees, slow and quiet and careful not to wake the frost too quickly. It didn't arrive with thunder or wildflowers or any kind of drama, just the steady drip of icicles in the afternoon, and the dark, wet smell of thawing earth rising from beneath the snow. The days stretched a little longer. The sun stayed just a little warmer. Josie felt it first in her hands, less stiffness in the morning, more strength in her grip. She stood at the gate one morning, watching the lambs stumble around the pasture like they were drunk on the new season. Their soft bleats filled the valley with a kind of innocence she had nearly forgotten. She really laughed for the first time in months. Behind her, Calder limped his way down the slope, still favoring the side where Martha's knife had sliced him. But he moved. with purpose, his tail twitching, his ears high. The wound had healed slower than expected. But it hadn't broken him. Nothing ever had. He paused beside her, pressing his head gently against her hip. She scratched behind his ears. "You look better," she said. He huffed and sat in the mud, without complaint, watching the lambs like he'd always been in charge of them. Martha Langley had been taken south 3 weeks earlier, shackled in a wagon bound for Cheyenne. There hadn't been a trial yet, but the deputy said the charges were solid: attempted animal cruelty, endangerment of a minor, possession of poison with intent to harm. Some said she'd be sent to a sanatorium. Others whispered about prison. Josie didn't care. It didn't matter what walls they put around her, just that she never came back. Elias rode out each week to check on them, bringing supplies, bits of town news, and once a pair of thick wool socks that didn't itch. He never stayed too long, just long enough to repair a fence latch or tighten a door hinge. He never asked questions unless Josie volunteered answers. That was his way. One afternoon, while mending the barn latch together, Elias had cleared his throat awkwardly. "I sent a letter," he said, "to the Territorial Orphan Office. Told them about what happened, asked if they'd place you with someone local." Josie looked up. He wiped his hands on a rag. "Told them if no one stepped forward, they could consider my place." She didn't speak. "I don't know if I'd make a good father," he said. "But I know what it's like to need someone." Still, she said nothing. Just poured him coffee when they went back inside. That was answer enough. A few days later, a letter arrived by post. The handwriting on the envelope was neat and unfamiliar. Josie opened it on the porch while Calder lay stretched in the sun beside her. It was from her father's cousin in Denver, man and his wife, who had only just heard what had happened. They offered a home, a proper bed, a school, a new start. "Josie, read the letter twice." Her hands trembled the second time through. Then she looked at Calder. "I don't think you'd like Denver," she said. "Too many fences." Calder yawned and flopped onto his side. She folded the letter and tucked it into her coat pocket. Later, she'd write back a thank you and a kind no. She had work to do here. A dog to take care of. A home to shape with her own hands. Elias returned that evening with a new pair of boots and a pocket knife, wrapped in oiled cloth. "Every ranch hand ought to have a good blade," he said, offering it without ceremony. Josie unwrapped it like it was something sacred. The handle was smooth, the edge sharp and clean. "Thank you," she said. They sat on the porch afterward, Calder between them. The valley glowed gold as the sun dipped behind the hills. "You've done more work this spring than most grown men," Elias said. "Fences are mended. The chickens are fat. Livestock's healthy." Josie shrugged. Didn't have much choice. "Sometimes," Elias said, "that's how good folks are made." They sat in silence. The kind that didn't need filling. Calder rolled onto his back, one paw twitching in a dream. Elias chuckled. "You know," he said, "I've seen gunfighters, scouts, even one preacher face down danger, but I ain't never seen anything quite like that dog." Josie smiled softly. "He ain't just a dog." "No," Elias agreed. "He ain't." As the days passed, Calder healed more visibly. He spent his mornings chasing the lambs in gentle arcs, correcting them like a seasoned herder. He no longer limped unless the air turned wet or the mornings too cold. Josie called to him less with words and more with nods, gestures. He always knew what she meant. One morning, she walked out to the pasture with a tin pail full of scraps. Calder trailed behind her, nose twitching, alert as ever. At the fencer line, she stopped and crouched down. "I've been thinking," she said. "You need a new name." He tilted his head. Calder was the dog who watched, who waited. "But that's not who you are now." She leaned closer and whispered it into his ear. "Guardian." The dog blinked, then thumped his tail once against the dirt. From that day on, no one called him Calder. He was Guardian, and he lived up to the name every day. As spring deepened, Josie grew stronger. Her hands grew calloused, her shoulders squared. She built new garden beds. She birthed a breech calf by herself. She fixed the porch step that had squeaked since before she could remember. Folks in town started calling her Little McBride again, but there was nothing little about her anymore. Elias stopped visiting so often, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't need to. She was managing. She had become someone who didn't need saving. Still, on Sundays, he rode past the homestead, tipping his hat. Josie always waved from the gate, Guardian sitting proud beside her. The dog slowed with time. His muzzle grayed, his eyes clouded a little, but he never lost that steady watchfulness, that quiet knowing. One morning, Josie found him asleep beneath the tree by the barn. His breath had stopped sometime in the night. She buried him there with her own hands, wrapping him in the quilt he'd once shared with her in the hayloft. She laid a flat stone over the grave and carved a single word into it with her pocket knife, "Protector." Years later, when Josie was grey-haired herself and children came to visit the hollow to hear her stories, she would always begin the same way. There was once a dog who didn't need to growl to be heard. A dog who stood between me and the worst of the world, not because anyone told him to, but because he knew. He knew before I did. And when the children asked if he'd ever hurt anyone, she'd smile and say, no, he didn't need to. He made evil feel its own weight. And that was enough. Years passed, like the wind that whistled through sage hollows, sometimes fierce, sometimes silent, always there. The seasons rolled over one another until it was hard to tell where one ended and the next began, except by the way the ground felt under Josie's boots, or the smell that came off the creek in the spring. She grew into the kind of woman who didn't ask for much and didn't take what wasn't offered. Her hands became strong, her shoulders wide with labor. She could birth a calf, patch a leaky roof, shoot straight with a rifle, and tie a rope faster than most men in Red Butte. Folks stopped calling her Little McBride and simply said, Josie, like that name alone meant something solid, like oak or stone. The homestead stayed hers. No one came to claim it, and no one dared question her right. She worked it from sunup to sundown, each day bringing its own small victories: chickens that laid, lambs that fattened, fields that didn't flood in spring. She built her life slowly, with hard-earned habits and the quiet, steady presence of memory, and always, for as long as he could manage. Guardian was there. He no longer bounded across the fields like he used to. His joints ached on cold mornings, and his naps grew longer, but he remained her shadow. He'd still rise, stiff-legged but determined, whenever she crossed the yard. He would lie under the porch or just behind her heels while she milked the goats or mended a broken gate. His ears still twitched at the sound of strange boots. His eyes still narrowed at shadows. When town children came up with their parents to trade eggs or seek help with a sick animal, they were always told, mind the dog. He's a good one, but he's got a long memory. And they did. Because Guardian never barked without reason. One spring morning, the same kind of morning that once brought new lambs and melted the last crusts of snow, Josie found him beneath the tree out back, the one with the wide branches and the shade he liked best. He was lying in the grass, head resting on his paws, eyes closed. The frost had barely lifted from the fence posts, but the birds were already singing. She knew before she touched him, he was still warm, as if he'd only just drifted off. Josie knelt beside him, resting her hand on his greyed fur, stroking the side that had once been marked with a knife, but had healed into a scar as old as her past. You did good, she whispered. You did more than anyone ever asked. She buried him beneath that tree, dug the hole with her own hands, tears falling silently, mixing with the dirt. She placed a flat stone over him, carved one word into it with the pocket knife Elias had given her years ago, Protector. In the years that followed, Josie became something of a legend in Red Butte. Not the kind with tall tales and wild stories, but the quieter kind through action, not words. Children who once came for chores returned with their own children to axolescent on the porch while she told stories in the fading light. They all knew the story of the girl and the dog, and she told it with the same reverence every time. She would sit back in her old wooden rocker, her braids streaked with silver now, her voice a little thinner, but no less sure. There was a time, she'd begin, when I didn't know the difference between silence and safety. When I thought being tough meant staying quiet, and in that time, there was a dogger sheepdog, not fit for town work, not obedient in the usual sense. He didn't fetch or roll over, but he watched. The children would lean in. He saw what others didn't. Knew before I did when something wasn't right. He stood between me and cruelty, not because I told him to, but because it was who he was. Someone always asked, did he ever bite anybody? Josie would smile faintly, her eyes drifting out past the porch rail toward the hills. No, he didn't need to. He made evil feel its own weight. Sometimes the children didn't understand that, but their parents did, and they'd nod softly in the background, letting the silence speak. Josie stayed in Sage Hollow well into old age. She never married, never left. Elias Ward passed on quietly one winter, having never taken a wife or moved from his little cabin north of town. When the news reached her, Josie rode into town herself for the service. She stood straight-backed, wearing her father's coat. Though the shoulders didn't fit like they used to. She returned to the homestead alone, but not lonely. The wind still whispered through the cottonwoods. The snow still came every winter, soft and deep, making the land quiet and slow. And sometimes on the clearest nights when the fire burned low and the porch creaked in the cold, Josie swore she could hear it. A faint tread of paws across the boards. Not loud, not heavy, just enough to know she wasn't alone. You still checking in, she'd whisper, and if the wind hushed for a moment, if the house held its breath, she believed the answer was yes. Sometimes, she thought the bravest souls didn't carry guns. They didn't ride tall horses, or give speeches, or make noise. Sometimes they just stood beside you, silent, steady, and they never asked for anything in return. In Sage Hollow, they still say that on nights when the stars are sharp, and the snow settles in gentle drifts, if you listen close, you can hear it, the slow, soft padding of a dog's feet. They say he's still guarding the porch, still watching the hills, still keeping a promise.